We have to talk about California again because this is quite intense what's going on there right now. San Ramon, the Bay Area, we have a big cluster swarm again with like 4.2, the highest so far, over 70 earthquakes and counting right now in only the last 24 hours. If we go a little bit back in a larger time frame, it's way more of them. But while everyone is focused on the Bay Area swarms, guys, there's another place in Northern California that is constantly crackling like a live wire right now. So we will talk about that as well. So let's start. Okay, so you see the San Ramon area, which is quite populated there. And I want to go back here. You see the earthquake swarms here. That is the end of January. We had earthquakes, right? If we click on here, it tells us when did this happen? This happened yesterday. This was a 3.8. We see it here. But what's more interesting, let's go here. 4.2. This was happening just yesterday. And you see the cluster swarm. What I am showing you here is just the earthquakes in the last 7 days. And then from the 4.2, the earthquakes keep coming. 2.7, 2.3, 2.5, 2.8, 2.8, right? All there. And then all over 2 here, a 3.0 again in the afternoon yesterday, a 3.8 shortly after, and then 2.0, 2.6, 2.6, 2.8 also here. In a short period of time, almost all at the same time in the same area, clustered there. And then if we scroll up here, look at that. It keeps coming. This is all still yesterday. And then here, this is the third. It starts here. Gosh, there's so many. It's hard to tell. I already scrolled into the third here. So it started out with a 1.8 and then 2.6, 1.5, 2.3, a 3.4 in the morning, 4:30, 2.3, 2.7, another 2.8, and they keep coming, yeah? So interesting enough what is happening there right now. We just had another one happening there. And before we talk about that cluster swarm here, let me zoom in a little bit. It's a little bit inconvenient if you look how densely populated this is, right? In California, they built a lot of subdivisions right on top of fault lines. And you might now think, ooh, is this the San Andreas Fault, right? What is this doing? But guys, if we zoom out, something else comes to mind, and this is this swarm here. So what's the deal with this? We will also talk about that. And all together, I mean, if we look at the Pacific Ring of Fire just for a short second, right? We see here, this is the San Andreas Fault area, but we see Alaska, and here we have earthquakes there every day, all day. But let's focus on California here with these earthquake swarms. So what is going on in San Ramon? And something unusual is happening under San Ramon. We're not having one isolated earthquake. We have a burst, we have a swarm, and we've been dealing with this for weeks now. But 4.2, it's getting in the higher ranges. In just the last couple of days, the people around the East Bay felt this repeated shaking with the biggest jolt reaching that magnitude 4.2 earthquake, and then more stronger quakes continuing afterwards. And this is the part that somewhat grabs me, right? A swarm, we know it's the earth crackling. That's what it is, right? It's like a fault zone adjusting in a bunch of small pops instead of hopefully one big cleanup. But smaller swarms don't mean necessarily stress release, and they don't mean that the risk for a bigger one is not present, unfortunately. So, but if we have these cluster swarms, psychologically, that can feel worse than one bigger quake because you can't settle down. It's rattling you all the time. And especially since we've seen it's right underneath subdivisions, right? They just keep coming. And now, before anybody jumps to conclusions that this means, oh, the big one is coming, right? Let's be honest and let's give a science-based answer. Luckily, most seismic swarms do not turn into a major earthquake, but you can never rule it out that they could be foreshocks, right? But one thing they do tell you clearly is you live in or on top of an active fault system, and the Bay Area's long-term earthquake risk, oh, we know that it is real. So the largest earthquake felt right now is magnitude 4.2 as part of a swarm. Depth roughly 8 to 10 kilometers, roughly 5 to 7 miles. These are typical crustal quake depth that occur in this area. Local reporting described the swarm as over 20 events where it was clustering and outbursts, right? So the headline that we see everywhere is a continuing swarm with one standout mid-magnitude 4 quake and lots of repeats, smaller repeats. And people are mixing the quakes up. They're saying foreshocks, aftershocks, main shocks, right? Aftershocks is you get one main quake, then smaller ones as the area settles down. If we're dealing with a swarm, you get many quakes clustered in the same area without a single obvious main shock doing all the work. And that's what we're dealing with here. I showed you we have 3.8, we have many in that same range because it matters. Because a swarm often points to a complex little fault strands, and or this could also be the case, fluids moving into cracks and triggering them, right? Not necessarily a major fault segment ripping open like the San Andreas Fault. So that's one reason why swarms often, and hopefully this one, stay somewhat moderate. But is this the case here? That's the thing. Which fault lines are involved here? What's the wiring underneath San Ramon? And is this connected to the other swarm that's going on that I showed you in the beginning? So unfortunately, San Ramon sits in the East Bay Fault network. Many, many fault lines. It's part of the broader transform boundary where the Pacific plate slides past the North American plate along the San Andreas Fault system. So how do we say that in plain English? I would say California isn't being squeezed straight on, it's being shared sideways. That sideways motion is carried by multiple faults there and not just one. And the key local suspect there is, we talked about it, the Calaveras Fault. For San Ramon specifically, the major nearby active fault commonly cited for rupture potential is the Calaveras Fault. And this is quite an unsettling fault, I have to say. It runs through the East Bay corridor and it's the frequent source of moderate earthquakes. So probably the swarm that we're dealing with right now is the Calaveras Fault zone, but also very close nearby. And that's the thing. We know one fault system can trigger the next one. And the bigger the quakes, the more rattling the other fault system experience. And if something's locked and loaded, it can be set free through that rattling. The bigger worry nearby, the Hayward fault system. The Hayward fault system, it's just west of the Calaveras Fault, and it's famous because it runs through even more heavily populated parts of the East Bay, and it has produced major historical earthquakes. It's also considered one of the most concerning long-term hazards in the region. So not only our friend, well, it's not really our friend, the San Andreas Fault is the big culprit here. And there is a connection problem between the Calaveras Fault and the Hayward Fault. And that is never good, because this is where conceptually, guys, it gets serious, because researchers have argued that the Hayward and the Calaveras Fault are connected at depth, meaning a combined rupture is physically plausible, and that could reach, and that's dangerous, around a 7.3 underneath this heavily densely populated area. That's the worst case linked scenario that could happen, right? But important, this does not mean that this swarm right now is about to do that, right? It means the geometry of the system is one reason that the East Bay is taken so seriously in hazard planning. You have to. But there's another, let's call it regional partner in the same hazard picture. Another fault, the Rogers Creek Fault. This is the lesser known one. You maybe have not heard about it. This one is more like North Bay than East Bay, but it matters. And I tell you why. It matters because the Bay Area probably forecasts highlight it alongside the Hayward, Calaveras, San Andreas Fault as a major contributor to regional risk. Boof, that doesn't sound good. This sounds like if Shizzy's hitting the fizzy, you don't want to be there. So what's the risk right now versus long term? Right now, I'm talking the next hours, next few days. Most likely outcome, hopefully, is more small to moderate earthquakes occurring there, gradually, hopefully tapering off, but we've seen over the last few months, and then it restarts. The uncomfortable truth, though, is you can't rule out larger quakes because it is a swarm. But the odds are generally still low that a swarm is stepping up into a major rupture. If we look at local expert commentary and past Bay Area swarm behavior, that supports that most swarms do not become big events until they do, right? This is unfortunately the problem. So this swarm doesn't predict the big quake, but it does us give a reminder that people there are sitting on an active fault system machine. This is how we can call it. And if we look at the long term, like years to decades, this is the big one that's coming that people ignore until they can't. And it could happen tomorrow, let's be clear about that. So the working group on California's earthquake probabilities, together with the US Geological Survey, they forecast for the Bay Area that there's about a 72% chance of at least one magnitude 6.7 earthquake, 6.7 plus earthquake in the Bay Area. And they gave that in the window from 2014 to 2043, 72% chance. So we're 12 years in already. Keep that in mind. This is unsettling. It's not San Ramon specifically, I want to say that, but it is the, how can we say, the sober, correct context. Big earthquakes, there are a when, not an if at the regional scale. What about the other cluster there? That's interesting. If we zoom in near like Caldwell Pines in California. So Caldwell Pines and this area is in Northern California near the Clear Lake, Geysers Geothermal region northwest of the San Francisco Bay Area. While the Bay Area is seismically dominated by the San Andreas system and the other faults that we just mentioned, Hayward, Calaveras, Rogers Creek, the Clear Lake, the Cobb, the Caldwell Pines area is a different geological zone. It's different. In that region, if we have earthquakes, the seismicity is connected more to a network of smaller faults that are running through the coast ranges and the Clear Lake volcanic area, like not the major transform faults that are farther south. So we're not dealing with the San Andreas Fault. So why is there a cluster? We have one such structure, that's the Caldwell Pines Fault, that is part of an extensional, like a pull apart zone that is linked to the broader tectonic regime in the Clear Lake and Geysers region. So these faults, they trend northeast, southwest, and they are associated with local crust stretching and geothermal activity because the crust is thinned there. So if we see earthquakes in this area, it can be tied to several influences. like fault creek, small stick slip motion along the local fracture network, geothermal fluid movement in cracked rock, because the Geysers field is the largest geothermal field in the US. It's huge. Basically, steam is extracted from deep fractures. But of course, I mentioned it earlier, volcanic and heat flow influences are happening there as well from the underlying Clear Lake volcanic field. Because of this whole complexity, small quakes in that cluster are sometimes linked to more local geology and thermal processes than to the big plate boundary motion that we see on the San Andreas Fault further south. Several years ago, there was a 3.4 quake in that area. So none of the faults in that area are historically known to produce really large earthquakes. But we have to say, because there aren't records of major historic quakes there, these fault lines there, they definitely contribute to background seismicity. So if we see quake feeds, the area here often appears like near Cobb or near the Geysers. We're seeing a continuing seismic swarm there. We can compare this as like a machine gun pattern of small earthquakes. And the reason there right now probably is also wild, because humans are partly involved. Because this, you probably know by now if you watch my channel more often. And guys, please give this video a like and a hype. Doesn't cost you anything. It helps my channel. The Geyser's geothermal field, it produces power by pulling steam and heat out of fractured rock, and operators also inject water back into that reservoir. So there are pressure and temperature changes that come with this, and that can trigger lots of small earthquakes on these small fractures. And the USGS is very explicit about this. They say activities associated with geothermal production cause or induce small earthquakes in the field. So this swarm is probably a mixed induced plus tectonic combined, right? Naturally tectonically stressed Northern California coast ranges, few geothermal operations can nudge the small faults and fractures over the edge, producing many microquakes. Is there any risk? Short-term, days, many more small quakes are likely because this behaves like an ongoing crackling zone. Is there a big destructive earthquake risk? Not here. Major regional faults are miles away. San Andreas Fault, Rogers Creek, Harrodsburg system. But if you live nearby, even the small quakes can still mean, well, we could call it nuisance shaking, right? Also, this cluster here is not the big one starting. This zone has frequent microseismicity and swarms. So this pattern alone is not a reliable predictor of a major Bay Area rupture. It's not connected. So I hope you found this interesting, guys. There's so much going on. Check the videos in the end screen. Thanks for liking, hyping, share it with your friends. Let me know in the comments, would you be concerned if you lived on top of one of these fault lines, or do you live? Let me know your experience. How are you preparing for that? Guys, be prepared, stay safe, and I hope I see you in a second in the next one. Bye-bye.